is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
I think when most people think about the relationship between technology and humanity, they sort of think that humans really are the driving force in that relationship, that humans are influencing technology, and it's sort of like, you know, they're driving a car and they're determining where it goes. But I think the influence actually goes both ways, that humanity influences technology and technology influences humanity. And I really like to focus on that second direction where technology is influencing humanity. So years ago, I wrote a piece about how cars created the megachurch, and really argued that because of the car culture that emerged in the mid-20th century, it really created this space where people could travel a great distance to go to church. And, you know, suddenly churches had to expand their parking lots, and now parking lots are a bigger footprint than the actual building. And the options that people have in sort of traveling to a church means that they have, you know, 20 times as many options as to where they go to church. And they suddenly become church shoppers, and they're shopping around for churches. Whereas, you know, prior to the car, they had to kind of walk to church or ride a horse, and their options were much more limited. And so they weren't really church shopping. And so that influence, you know, they're driving the car, but the car is also determining what their options look like. And so I think as we think about the ways that humanity and technology interact, we have to recognize that technology is shaping our experience as much as anything. And I think people sort of intuit that, but the sort of common sense idea is that we're really in the driver's seat. And we're in the driver's seat, but it's shaping the way that we look at the world and the way that our environment forms around us.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of Sherry Turkle's line, our tools shape us.
Yeah.
So, you know, a hammer gives you a hammer-shaped forearm in that way. So
yeah, and to you, everything looks like a nail. You're looking for more ways to use this hammer. You're looking for more ways to use this car. Can I use this in a drive-through? And so we start to form our world around the tools that we have available to us.
Yeah, I just saw an article about a mega church. I think it was in Minneapolis, that the city or the county would not approve the plans for their new campus because of parking. The parking lots were so large, right? And it was like a environmental issue, right?
Yeah.
So to the point. I don't think most people, when I said technology, thought you were going to whip out a car, because, you know, if you stop and think about it, yes, cars have tech. We would say, or most people would think, cars have technology in them, but you just flat out equated a car to technology. So what else counts as technology?
Oh man, a lot of things. I would say, if you want to go, you know, back into history, I think fire counts as technology. It's cooking our food, and it's in some ways becoming an external stomach, enabling us to digest food in ways and break down that food for us kind of prior to our consuming it. I think you could argue that language is a kind of technology. It's certainly shaping the ways that we understand ourselves, the ways that we see the world, the ways that we frame our experiences. And, you know, if you want to go back into Genesis, those fig leaves that Adam and Eve put on could be considered technology. And, you know, the beautiful story there is that in their sort of attempt to cover themselves in their shame and their sin, you know, the first upgrade in technology comes from God himself. You know, he gives them leather coverings. but it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of the lives of animals. And so, even in that, we sort of see the ways that our technology certainly can serve us. And I think, God sees technology as something that can be part of his creation. But it does come at the cost of that creation in different ways. So, I would go that far back in thinking, how do I define technology? But yeah, it's a very broad term. Of course, Jesus was called a tecton. I've heard people say he was the techie of his day. I don't know if I would go that far, but I sort of get that.
Tecton
idea.
meaning builder, which I think today we would actually not call him a carpenter, but a stonemason, I think would be the term we would use for Jesus today, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that carpenter, and then, of course, that fires up the American imagination. We have him building table. Or what that meme I saw the other day was, hey, did you hear that guy who built our table got crucified by the Romans? So that kind of idea that he was just this common, which maybe he was. And there's probably reasons from the Acts of Thomas to think that that's what's being described. But the hammer is the technology. The pencil is there's a famous essay, This is a Pencil, which talks about the economics of the technology and the globalism of the technology.
Yes.
A notepad then is a technology. It reminded me the fire as external stomach. I'd never heard that before, but I love that. A notepad is external mind. There's a whole philosophy of mind that says you kind of outsource your memory to the notepad. As long as you know where the notepad is, then that it in some ways becomes part of your mind or your mental activity.
And I think that's why the smartphone has become so central to our lives, is that it is in a lot of ways both that notepad, but also that sort of external self in kind of representing our identity to ourselves, both through the social media platforms that we create and the ways that we present ourselves, but then also just the systems that are on the device to help us manage our lives, whether it's a calendar or a list app for groceries or a packing list or whatever it is. All those things we're kind of outsourcing, and so it becomes, and then also our relationships. It informs. We're so tied to it because it represents connection to meaningful relationships, and we often denigrate our sort of addiction to our smartphones, and I think there's some relevance or validity to that, but I think we also need to recognize that there are ways that we're using it, and we need to kind of recognize what we're using it for. Are we using it to connect with others in meaningful ways? I think that's a valid way to do it, and not as a replacement for those relationships in person, but as a supplement, sure. And so, it represents both our identity and our connections to others, and that's in large part why it is so important to us.
Do you remember when Boston Dynamics, they had this secret thing that eventually got revealed as the Segway? It was this big secret for a couple of years. I think Steve Jobs got to go see it before it was revealed, and he said it's gonna change the architecture of cities and all this stuff. And I always think it. And then it came out, and you're like, oh well, that's cool, but I don't know about changing the architecture of cities. Do you think if you were to pick a technology that has actually changed the way our world works, is it the smartphone? Just like the way trucks drive, the way we navigate our space, the way we think about ourselves.
I think there's a few technologies like that. Certainly the printing press, I think the car, and I think the smartphone would all kind of fall in the same.
And the iron plow. Don't forget the iron plow.
Yes.
That was a game changer. Probably one of the biggest technology shifts in human history.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a fantastic book to write, kind of what those key moments were. But in the past 500 years, those are the ones that I would point to.
So you've done this stuff, for a book I did on ritual. I read a bunch of the research on the smartphone use and the apps on the smartphone use, and it was pretty universally negative. I mean, it was really hard to find somebody who was like, "Yeah, this is great.
Sure.
We should keep doing it unreservedly." But I kind of took that on and was very worried about it and kind of harped on my students about it for years and years. And what I found, though, is I was worried about the millennials who were like uncritically imbibing in their phone.
Yeah.
Are you as worried about it still, or do you think like with a lot of things, the initial behavior tapers and becomes more reasonable over time?
Man, I see my 17-year-old nephew, who's Gen Z, I see him integrate the phone into his experience. Maybe in healthier ways, but I mean, there are certainly times where, he has to be told to get off his phone and interact with people at the table.
Right.
And, mostly, for the most part, he puts it away at any sort of dinner table. But I would say I distinguish between supplement and replacement. So if it's replacing our interactions with others, if it's replacing our even ability to do creative thinking or something like that, I think that's problematic. But as a supplement, that's enabling us to connect with others, and in some ways extending our creativity, for example. I think it can be integrated in semi-healthy ways, I think it's always going to be a bit of a tension there.
Yeah. At one point, our kids are all in their 20s. We have one 17-year-old left.
Yeah.
The rest of them are in their 20s. And watching them go through this, we actually had to make a distinction because we just had kind of screen time limits on everything. And at some point, I'm like, well, my son actually likes to make music on FL Studios or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's creating something, not merely playing a video game and consuming or checking out. So we kind of separated screen time into productive screen time instead of reductive. I don't know what our other one was. Consumption screen time.
Yeah. I think creative versus consumptive is a great kind of boundary line for thinking about how am I engaging with this. I know even in the past, couple years for myself, I've sought ways to spend more time in creative activities versus consumptive ones. And so I think, parents who are thinking about that or people who are thinking about it for themselves, if you can think about what am I doing here, and how is that, what do I want to be doing with my time? And then I think, for me, I do have screen time limits for a couple apps on my phone, but I realized, the 90% of the apps I have, I don't feel compelled to, I don't feel addicted to. And there's, the apps that I feel that I need limits on are either my social apps or news apps. That's just what it is for me. And I think, it might be different for other people, but that was helpful. My notes app, I don't feel addicted to my notes app. I'm not going to spend hours in my notes app.
Your bill paying app.
Yeah, exactly. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. And so I don't need screen time limits on those. It's really, drilling down a little bit and nuancing what types of apps am I really needing to, hold these lines on.
Yeah, I remember Adam Alter wrote a book. I don't remember the title of it, but it was about technology use. And he talked about hooks in apps, that there's these hooks that keep you in, like a casino, they don't put clocks on the walls. And I've noticed that, like, I have a block, like a mindless block playing app that I sometimes use to clear my mind. But I noticed it doesn't have it doesn't let you see the clock. It doesn't let you see the time, right? Because it doesn't want you to quit playing the game.
Yeah.
And so his antidote is like green space. Get out and go out into nature, because nature is hook free. It doesn't have anything that's trying to addict you to it, right?
Yeah.
It's just natural goodness or whatever, and ecotherapy or whatever is the boundary of that. But it makes me think like, okay, what is what I'm doing? How does it hook me in? And he gives this, I think, a test of like, do you lose track of time?
Yeah.
Do you want to quit doing it, but you keep doing it? I mean, it's all like addictive behaviors, right? But I do find that my freshmen come in very much more kind of in tune. Like I used to make them do like a week during Leviticus where they had to have no screen time and then journal for like 48 hours and then try to go a whole week. And some of them did. And some of them would have near like addiction withdrawals. I mean, they would go through emotional roller coaster over time. And but then after a while, the last few years of doing that, students would say like, oh yeah, I often take Instagram off my phone for months at a time, just, because I see it's getting to me or whatever. So they seem to be regulating a little bit better now.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that. I have friends who do similar things, and, full disclosure and confession, my addiction is TikTok, and it is one of those experiences where I, maybe want to get off it sooner than I do. But I do have, limits on it. And so, once I pass that, then I'm having to enter my, passcode and, add another 15 minutes and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But, it certainly made me step back and say, this is very consumptive. Where is the creativity in my life that I can bring back in and spend more time doing that? But, the TikTok certainly, it's sort of a substitute for watching a movie or watching television.
Right.
So if you're streaming, that's just as addictive in certain ways.
Right.
And so,
it's the Twitter of television shows. Right. The microblogging, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. I did see, that was one of the things I noticed with my own kids is when they started watching Vines and then TikToks, their sense of humor changed. Like, I feel like within a year, people were thinking in like 60-second blocks of humor. Like tell them a Norm Macdonald 3-minute joke and they're out. They can't hang in for the punchline. So, so that was an interesting transformation. Okay, so to let you know what's going, you might already know this, but to let you know what's going on the campus. I'm switching to creativity because I just got an email inviting me to a session at the library to talk about using AI as a creativity booster, right? Like to generate ideas in a workshop. I'm working with a guy, this Muslim scholar, who we were working on this grant proposal, and he said, hey, I want to give me some time. I'm going to go on AI and I'm going to try to generate some ideas. And I'd never heard of that before. I will tell you, in the last year, I think it's generally true that many of us professors have switched to oral exams or in-class writing assignments.
Okay.
Because we don't want to read a bunch of AI, basically.
Yes. I support that.
And I use AI in class. Like sometimes the student will ask a question, I'll be like, well, let's ask the AI and see what it says. And sometimes I'm shocked by, it mixes really good answers with just really bad trash, right? And, side by side, because it hallucinates and can't tell the same. I had my first plagiarized, like clearly AI paper, which was tricky because I read it and I was like, there's no way this isn't AI. And I put it in 3 AI checkers and it's like, 100%. And fortunately, the person fessed to it immediately and was repentant and it all worked out fine. But this, I think it's the boogeyman, but I think it's mostly the boogeyman because of what you said earlier, that kind of hammer and nail. Like, I've got a hammer now, what can I do with this thing?
Yeah.
And we're not really sure what all you can do with AI at this point.
Yeah.
So what worries you about AI and what gives you hope about the different visual and textual AI use? Maybe hope first, because I feel like the worry one is probably longer.
Yeah. I'm using AI systems definitely for that brainstorming sort of get my creativity juices flowing a little bit. Over New Year's, friends and I were celebrating New Year's, and as sort of a party game, we created a March Madness bracket of John Travolta movies to vote on which movie was most John Travolta. And I was trying to come up with a title for this event, and so I, punched it in ChatGPT, and it came out with a couple different ideas based on some of his movies, and I didn't take any of them, but it got me, down the path to come up with the title, which was Pulp Fever Face Off. So 3 of his movies: Pulp Fiction, Saturday Night Fever, and Face Off. I
forgot about that whole Face Off movie.
Yes, probably best. But it gets it gets those creative juices flowing, and that's what I came up with. So yeah, the creative opportunities there, and I think the opportunities then to use it for really getting started. If you're like scoping out a project, trying to think, what categories do I need to come up with to address in a paper? If I'm going to talk about all the key elements of this issue, what do I need to address? And it can sort of give you a good outline to start with, but filling in that outline, I think, then needs to be on you. And you can, go and do the research in that. I've used it for writing HTML and CSS. I don't really know those very well. I know just enough to be dangerous.
That makes much more sense. Yeah. Coders are using a lot of AI to just write code very quickly, right?
Yeah. And so, it goes down that path for you. But the reality is, all of those sparks of ideas are still coming from me. I'm still saying, I want titles for a March Madness bracket about John Travolta. And that's, that seed of the idea is mine, and then, extrapolating it out is what the GPT systems are doing. And so those are sort of the hopes, but it's also that's the thing I think that I'm thinking about as a worry as well. What is the value of my being able to brainstorm and think in lateral ways? And what's the value of that practice, that habit of doing that work myself and thinking along, different trains of thought? I think there's something real and meaningful and valuable for us to develop a practice like that. I think including for critical thinking, because I think critical thinking requires us to, in some ways, be creative and to think about a issue from multiple angles, multiple viewpoints. And we have to do sort of lateral thinking to do that. And it requires a kind of brainstorming. And if I don't exercise that muscle, that brainstorming muscle, and I kind of outsource all of that to a GPT system, then I'm not going to have that muscle when I need it. And so that, certainly has me concerned as well. And I don't know how to, untangle those issues.
Yeah, and it certainly, I think what you're saying undermines it's just another tool in the tool belt, which is true, but there's some danger of it. If you quit using the hammer because you're using the electric hammer, the nail driver, that's the electric hammer. I've had carpenter friends who said this, guys come on and they're so used to using nail drivers that they actually can't toenail anymore. They can't do the basic skills.
Sure.
I worry in the military, they use all rifles with optics now on them, where it used to be just cold steel sights that you had to be able to shoot, and then you can add optics on as you know them. So maybe it's that training side that you teach students how to shoot with cold steel, And then you say, now I can give you this tool. And the same way that, I went to seminary. I think you went to seminary as well. I had some theological training.
Yeah.
A bit. And they had these softwares like BibleWorks and Logos and stuff.
Sure.
And I just committed that I was not going to buy any of that software until after I finished seminary. Like I wanted to do all the work and make sure that I understood it. And then I did. And the year after I graduated from seminary, I bought BibleWorks and learned how to use all of its archaic techniques to look up things and to do polyvalent searches. And then it went out of business, and now I have all this useless knowledge of that piece of software, that boutique piece of software. But it's great. I still keep it on a Microsoft emulator on my computer. But that issue of the atrophied muscle, it seems to me that we can kind of wring our hands and say, we're worried about this. But unless we actually do some kind of educational system that ensures that people have the basic skills, and then you hand them the advanced tools, I don't know how we're not going to slide off into the epitome of death, to put it politely.
Well, I think it's a worthwhile conversation in that sort of stack of knowledge to ask how should we build that stack of knowledge? There's I think a term in education around the Common Core, which I think might get at that a little bit. The idea is that there needs to be a kind of a base of knowledge that we start with. But yeah, the tools, AI systems being the most obvious these days, is they're subsuming a lot of knowledge and supplying it as a service to an individual without, and that person doesn't need any sort of underlying knowledge to use it. And I think it's a worthwhile question to ask and a conversation to have. Do we need to have a common foundation of knowledge that we start from? And I don't know
skills as much as knowledge. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe we should say go back a little bit and say you just said GPT a couple times. I noticed on your webpage you talk about Bible GPTs. What is a GPT?
Yeah, generative pre-trained transformer. So what that means is, I'll focus on the pre-trained. It's an AI system, and AI systems are looking for patterns, and based on those patterns, they're labeling things. And so if I show it 1 million pictures of cats, it's going to look for patterns in the pictures in order to identify the next picture that it doesn't have in its database. And so if I show it 1 million pictures of cats, it finds all the patterns that are relevant to, all of these that are labeled cats. And then, I show it a picture of a giraffe, and I ask it, is this a cat or is this not a cat? It's going to compare it to the pattern it has and say, no, this is not a cat. And generative means that it sort of turns that around, and it takes all of its knowledge of what a cat pattern looks like, and it reproduces what fits the pattern most obviously. And so, what it does with images, it's also doing with text. So it's really looking for the most common next word in a sentence. So, if I say, oh, say, can you, most people are going to, add the right next word if you live in the U.S. And so, a GPT system knows that there's a pattern to that sequence of words, and it's going to fill in the blanks. And generative AI is just doing that kind of ad infinitum. And that's generally how it's working.
Are simple question, are GPTs pre-human?
Pre-human. Like, could they become sentient beings at some point?
Yeah. I mean, I watched Battlestar Galactica at one point, so.
Yeah, so, those AI systems are considered narrow AI as opposed to general AI. And beyond that is sort of the Hollywood version, which is super artificial intelligence. GPT systems are sort of a narrow AI, and whether and when we would get to general or super artificial intelligence is TBD. Is it pre-human? I don't really think so. I don't think it is conscious. I don't think it's self-aware. However, I think the definitions of what we mean by consciousness is still a philosophical black hole that has not been resolved. How do we understand what consciousness is considered a hard problem in philosophy.
Yeah. Is ChatGPT, the text-based version, maybe even the visual versions like Midjourney, are they racist?
They're biased. And so if I'm trying to think of a good example for you. So, in the U.S., anyone who has a driver's license has their photo in a national database. And so the facial recognition that's running on that database is available to the government. And then there's, also databases from a history of policing over the last 50 years, and includes the ways that, police arrest certain people more than others, and, they get fingerprinted and identified. And all of that data is the data being used for AI systems in criminal justice today. And so the policing practices and procedures that have been used over the last 50 years, that in some cases are systemically racist, are being used. And so when that data gets integrated into an AI system that's then looking for this type of person who, has this sort of criminal record, it's going to manifest based on that that set of data what the most likely kind of person is, and so it's going to be biased towards if you have a system that says these are all people with a criminal record, show me the next type of person that's going to have a criminal record. It's going to, just like the cat, it's going to produce something that looks like a cat, whether or not that is a fair representation of the larger population. And so, yes, it is biased. My understanding of racism is that there's, more of a human intention there,
right,
or human perspective. And so you could certainly argue that it's racist, but I think it's more generic to call it bias.
Right. Yeah. In some ways, it sounds like what you're describing is essentially AI, the outputs of generative AI are in some ways a mirror to the generative outputs of humans. So if a certain class and race of people have written more, have been more published, and that's what AI is trained on, then it's going to reflect the nature of what it was trained on. In the same way that somebody who's raised in Texas versus California versus the Philippines is going to reflect the kind of the text and the traditions that they were raised upon. So this again is sounding very human to me.
Yeah, I think it is in ways a mirror, and like a mirror, the benefit is that it allows us to look at ourselves somewhat objectively and to say we want to be a better person, or I want to do my hair differently. I want to look a little bit different. I want to dress better, but the mirror is, also an inverted image. We're seeing ourselves backwards to the way the world sees us. So there are ways that AI systems certainly reflect us, but we need to sort of think through what those things are. But it allows us that opportunity to have a conversation, an explicit conversation. Do we want to be the type of people that arrest people for based on the color of their skin? No, we don't. We want a different way of policing, and we want to move towards that, and so that opens a door for that conversation to really happen.
I've found with undergraduates, and it may be true more generally in the general population, but with undergraduates, one of their difficulties, they always want to look up for papers. They want to look up sources online. Mm-hmm. They want to use web pages. They want to use things that we wouldn't consider academic sources.
Sure.
And I just say, look, whatever your source is, it has to have a name and a credential behind it.
Yes.
Like to say, why is this person the right person to write on this topic? Like you on technology.
Great.
There's a reason why we're talking to you, right? But I found that they have a great difficulty. Like all information on their web browser is essentially of equal merit, unless they personally disagree with it. But they don't have, it's kind of all whitewashed. It's like, yeah, I got it from the internet. Like, well, there is no the internet that produces anything. It was a person who made that blog, who wrote that post, who wrote that article or whatever. But it seems to me with generative AIs, it actually is true that you could say, well, yeah, the internet said it really does not fully anonymize the source, and that in itself seems to create more proliferating difficulties for thinking about the AI as a source rather than maybe a resource.
Yes, I think that's a fair concern and a fair point. Yeah, it is representing. I was going to say, yes, it is representing the internet, but we have to understand that OpenAI, Anthropic, Google Bard, each of these systems, again, it's pre-trained. So
right.
Part of that pre-training means that when these GPT systems produced an output, there was a group of people who said, this is a good output and that's a bad output. Do more of the good output. And so part of the training in the process was redefining what the target of a good output is. And there was a group of people. In the case of OpenAI, they actually employed people in Kenya at very low wages to review the outputs of the ChatGPT and to grade them and say, this is a good output, this is a bad output. And so there is still a sort of human in the loop and a human, you could say, prejudice or bias for what a good output looks like and what a bad output looks like. And so even as we might say, we can cite, quote unquote, the internet using a GPT system, the fact is that's a very filtered and specified way of representing what the internet, what all of the internet would be saying.
Yeah, to me, everything you're saying humanizes the AI. It's not the mystical void of the internet. It actually is a very human process from beginning to end.
Yeah, for sure.
Even if I've heard correctly, I think I've heard in several, podcasts that people say there's actually no way to trace back causal, links between what you ask and what the generative AI gives. Like they can't go through the code and figure out what happened. And that seems to be what scares a lot. I mean, there's the signed petition by this guy who was an early inventor of AI. He's like, this is dangerous. Is that what they're worried about? Is you can't causally trace how it came to the conclusions it came to?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Within a GPT system, it's using math to do language. So it's saying, say, can you, there's a 90% chance that the next word should be see. There's a 10% chance that it should be a different word. And therefore, we're going to go with the 90%. And it's doing this. It's doing that for every word. It's calculating a percentage likelihood for every word, and that's based on, reading large amounts of the internet and correlating how often do these words go together, and that math model, that algorithm is so large. I mean, it's billions, if not trillions, of data points correlating words, correlating phrases, correlating, larger concepts together, and tracing out across those billions, like no human individual can, evaluate or review that process.
I know I said we're going to keep this shorter, but everything you're saying is so fascinating. I do want to connect this to Bible study, because I know people who are working on Bible software apps right now that where the layperson is reading a section of Scripture and they can just click and say, ask AI to give me an interpretation of this passage.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds like a horrible idea, but I wonder how it sounds to you. You know more about it. So how does that idea sound to you?
Yeah, the way I'm thinking about it right now, so we, for a couple centuries, people have been really advocating for the historical grammatical method of interpretation. There are other methods, but that's a popular one. I want to call an AI system the statistical probabilistic method of interpretation. So instead of using a historical grammatical method, it's using a statistical method of interpretation. And I think seminarians, pastors, theologians, biblical scholars need to critically wrestle with that question. Is a statistical method of interpretation a valid method of interpretation? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is, for me, a helpful way to frame it. I think that analogy is really helpful. And I don't know that it's even an analogy. I think it's literally what it is. And I think we need to spend time critically evaluating, is a statistical method of interpretation a valid way to do it? And maybe it is, or maybe it's just one among a set of ways that we interpret Scripture. And it could be, again, a voice in the conversation, but it's not the only voice. Again, it's not a replacement for all these other modes of interpretation, but it is one mode of interpretation. I don't know. But I think the scholarly community has to wrestle with that and sort of critically evaluate it.
Yeah. And come again with some kind of educational program to work this stuff in or out. Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you very much for your wisdom and discernment. I'm glad there are people like you, smart people like you, working on this and helping us think through this. And we didn't even get to kind of a theological or biblical lens on this, but you've got all of that on your website, and you work out a lot of those issues for Christians. So I very much appreciate your time and your wisdom.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.